Welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. You guys, today, I kid you not, I have been waiting for this interview for like minimum 2 months now. I am so excited to have her on today. We have Monica Sok. She is the author of A Nail the Evening Hangs On and the chapbook The Year Zero. She's received a bunch of grants, such as the Elizabeth George Foundation, Hedgebrook, Jerome Foundation, Kudeman, McDowell, and the Wallace Stagner Fellowship at Stanford University. Her poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Paris Review, Poetry, Kenyon Review, and A New Republic, amongst many others. She's earned her MFA in creative writing at NYU and has recently taught at Stanford University and the Center of Empowering Refugees and Immigrants in Oakland. So basically, you guys, the queen of Cambodian poetry. I am so honored to have her here. Monica, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I won't claim that I'm the queen of Cambodian poetry because I'm just waiting to, I don't know, like I can't wait to read more poets who are all claiming to be queens. So if I can just say that, that's something I will put out there. So thank you so much.
Well, I got to be honest with you. Today, as I mentioned, I'm so excited to have you on here. I've read your book, A Nail the Evening Hangs On, which is what we'll be discussing today. But I just want to say that I've never read anything so beautifully written about what and how generational trauma feels like from so many different perspectives. Like, I felt like the way that you wrote it too, it was as if I had to kind of read the poems. I read the poems again and again, and each time that I read it, I felt like I got a little snippet and I found something new every time I read the poem. So I've truly never read anything and experienced anything like this before. So I guess my very, very first question to bring this all back, just tell me a little bit about yourself, Monica. Tell me about your upbringing. Where were you born? And what are the most important things about your childhood and your foundation that have created the Monica we see today?
Yeah, it means a lot to hear you say such kind words about my poems. And yeah, the very first book that I have, and the only book, like full-length collection that I have, I didn't really get to see how audiences, interacted with it in person because it came out in February 2020 and immediately we went into lockdown. And so it means a lot to always hear people, how they experienced the book. So thank you. So I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which people know as Amish country. And it was an incredible childhood for many reasons. Like I had all these questions about belonging, which is such a theme in our community and among many diasporic communities, right? And so only until recently did I actually learn to appreciate my hometown. And to be able to claim it as my hometown is also a big deal for me because, during my teenage years, always really angsty about fitting in with all these white Christian people and just not knowing where my family came from, So it's interesting to be able to connect to the community now, to my family's experiences there. I was visiting home recently and my mother and father, they had bought these those drumstick ice cream cones. They got a whole bunch of those from Costco. My mom was like, it's too sweet for you. And we need to just give it to the Amish kids. And I was like, are y'all sure? Like, it's dinner time. They're like, well, they can just eat it right away. I'm like, are you sure? Like their parents will let them? So it was really funny. We went to the farm and immediately when all of these kids just see my father's pickup truck like roll onto their gravel driveway. They start running over, and he pulls out this cooler full of ice cream cones. And, he's like yelling to the father on the porch of the house. And he's like, can they have ice cream? He's like, yeah, that's fine. Do you want your cooler back? And all the kids are just so excited to see my like Cambodian parents, like it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see the way that they also share the land. There is this farmer named Abner. He's so kind, and he's just this old man. He doesn't really have his kids around to help him out on the farm. But my father goes and he like helps him wash these watermelons so that he can sell them. And in return, Abner has given him like a plot of land that is reserved for him, and it's just corn. So that come September, when the corn is tall and ready to eat, my dad has plenty. He's got like, he's just got like, it's so funny because he's like, yeah, I planted these. And I'm like, you mean Abner planted these? And he's like, yeah, we did it. We planted it together. And I'm like, okay, whatever you think, because at the end of the day, like that's him overseeing everything when my father isn't there. But it's so funny because immediately my mother and father get out of the truck and they're like picking the weeds out of the fields. And then one of the Amish girls, she's like the eldest daughter, she comes over and says hi to my parents. She's like 13 maybe. And, they have a relationship that I don't know much about, because I haven't been around, I haven't been home. But then my dad's like, hey, can you and your siblings help pick these weeds for me? It's like land I could feed, like enough corn to feed like 4 or 5 families. And then she's like, oh yeah, we do it all the time, And then my dad's like, great, I'm going to buy you some Costco pizza then in return for your labor. So, I mean, it's really fun to kind of, reconnect to my hometown, to Lancaster, and just the landscape. When I see an Amish buggy driving down the road or like clopping on the road as we're driving on the back roads, right? Like that's how I know I'm home, which is such an interesting image to think about as a marker for home, So my family, I have like one older brother. It was just us 4 in this landscape. And we had family in Harrisburg, like maybe less than an hour drive away, and some in Philly. And we had our own community, which was us, like our family of 4. But then we'd always be surrounded by our cousins and aunties and uncles, our grandmother, the only surviving grandparent we had. And I have like a lot of things I can tell you about growing up in Lancaster, apart from the feeling of being so isolated there, like, oh, I feel so isolated as a Khmer girl. But then I can look at my hometown now and recognize it as like a refugee capital in this country, and to kind of see all of the newer refugees in Lancaster, all of the beautiful restaurants. And like, I feel like I'm a marketing ad at this point. I'm sorry. I'm just like, everybody go visit Lancaster. But it's a really unique town. So I'm really glad that I can talk about it differently than I had in the past.
Yeah. Did your parents talk about their refugee experience when you were growing up?
No, they were definitely silent about a lot of their experiences. They never really did that thing where they shamed, me and my brother for all of the things that we had that they never had. They never really did that. I think they just appreciated all of the things, all of the opportunities we could explore, and they did everything they could to support us. But as for the Khmer Rouge regime and what they lived through, that didn't come through moments of like linearity. I caught these fragments of trauma that kind of just escaped their minds whenever they were driving. I think that's the biggest thing. They were driving, they're in control of a steering wheel. They're literally traveling through memory, but also in the physical world. and they are able to like release some of the information. And it's like, there was never a let's sit down and talk about this. It was always in these moments where I was always caught off guard. And then when those moments happened, I had to get into the mood of listening and letting it happen and appreciating it. And as a kid, I wasn't always able to do that. I didn't always have the capacity to hold all of these traumas that these adults had when they
Right.
were younger, when they were kids. So the heaviness was definitely there. And even if I didn't have access to their oral storytelling all the time, I just felt the the depth of our history. And not only until, let's see, when I was like 13, I was always in the library, that makes sense for me. But the librarian like chased me down the hallway in middle school, and I was like seventh grade. Mrs. McClune, she came over to me. She knew that I had to do like this biography or memoir presentation in English class. And she handed me Lung Eung's First They Killed My Father. So
Oh,
that was my
wow.
very first reference to a Khmer person talking about their history.
And you probably learned a lot of your own history through First They Killed My Father as
Right,
well, because it
right,
wasn't,
exactly.
taught in history books. I mean, that was my experience as well. Like my father sharing only fragments. For him, it was at the dinner table, after he's had a
Yeah.
couple glasses of wine or whatever, when he lets the memories kind of flow. But do you remember a certain point where you had realized, I want to learn more about this? And how did you go about learning more about your own history?
It was that very moment when I had to do the presentation in class, and I realized how much it meant to me as I was speaking to all of like these white kids about my history. Because the whole time I've been learning about American history with them. So, I was young. I didn't really understand what I was really saying. I just had a report to do, and then I did it, and I did it well. But then
Mhm.
I was also so overwhelmingly emotional that, of course, the questions began there in that moment. I
Mhm.
had to keep searching. It was challenging though, because, like you said, like we didn't really grow up with, all of these academic textbooks that had entire chapters, about what happened in Cambodia and US involvement, all of that. We didn't get to really have any access to that. So the curiosity began there. And I went to college, and I did everything I could to find a way to like study abroad in Cambodia.
Mm.
And I was able to get this scholarship so I could study a year long or be part of a year long exchange program in Vietnam, because that was the only way I could get into the region. And part of this year long study in Saigon, I was able to do a field study in Cambodia
Mm.
and also take a field trip to Laos. So I got to
Mm.
go explore like political Southeast Asia in the context of like the war, the American war there. So I really got the opportunity to just understand myself as a Khmer person, not just in America, but in the world. So I was no longer asking myself, like, where do I belong just in my small hometown of Lancaster? I was all of a sudden like in a neighboring country to our ancestral homeland and
Yeah.
asking a lot of questions about the history there, and things there are things I just don't even know now. And so I'm overwhelmed with sometimes with just the flood of information that we're accessing today, which is exciting, but I'm like, oh my God, I don't know any of this. So I feel
Yeah.
like it's just going to take our whole lives to learn these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that whole experience like? I mean, for me, people have asked me all the time, like, have I gone back to Cambodia? And I haven't, unfortunately, only been as a middle schooler. I haven't yet been able to experience it as an adult. And especially now with his whole podcast and all this kind of reclaiming of my identity, I feel like that's been happening over the past 4 years with the podcast and everything. I can only imagine how it would feel like for me to go visit. You were in college, it seems like, when you were there. So I can imagine, like, just how was that experience overall?
Well, I actually went to Cambodia around the age of 10 with my mother, my father, my brother. And it was the only time that we've gone as a family. I mean, I think you asked me about like my questions about our history and, connected to like familial silence. But
Right.
now I'm thinking about it, like as a kid, that was the first time I really got to locate myself in the larger world as a Khmer girl. I was a kid and I was just like in wonder. So it was a very romantic kind of experience. And I got to meet all of my family members on my father's side. And I got to stay in my maternal grandmother's village in Prayang. And it's a very different Cambodia today, which, I haven't been since 2016. And I'd love to go back soon. So it feels like a long time. But ever since, I guess, I was a little girl, I just had this longing to go back to Cambodia and to go back, over and over again. I've had dreams of living there as well. And I've been told by some other Khmer artists that I need to go and just live there for a couple of years so I can, do my art there and write, which I think would offer a really beautiful and new perspective, in the work. But I went when I was a girl, and then as an adult for the first time, it was through that study abroad program that I was able to go. And while I was making all of these discoveries about myself, my history, like, I was like maybe 19, barely an adult, like a baby adult. So I remember like, in Saigon, I'm trying to recall memories I have there. And it's one of the most incredible life chapters I've ever had. And then like so much of it is in the back of my mind because, it's like, it was like a whole little microcosm of this young, just young me, like figuring things out. And so I discovered that I wanted to write poetry there. I discovered that it was something I already loved, but it was something that I was going to commit to. I will say that when I was in Cambodia and we were doing a field study there, I got to take classes at Panyasastra University, or Panyasa. It was around November and it was 2010. And I remember the first day we arrived, the water festival was happening. And I was walking around and just exploring and, looking at all the stuff that the vendors were selling and walking in and out of these markets, just taking everything in, passing the Independence Monument. And I was so hot and I just got so tired from the heat that I went back to Golden Gate Hotel and I climbed the nine staircases, like up to the ninth floor. And I just ordered room service and I just chilled. And all of the other students did the same thing. And then the next morning, we learned that there was a stampede on Diamond Island. And luckily, everyone we knew was okay, but there were certainly students at the university who died in that stampede. And it was such a quick turn from the wonder and awe of being in Cambodia. So it was no longer like this romantic version of what I had experienced as a 10-year-old. It was really sad. I just remember these American exchange students just taking the day that we had off after that happened. They just took the day to like kind of hang out and have fun. And the whole city was empty. And I don't know what it was like on April 17th, 1975, but I also understood that the city was empty during that
Mm-hmm.
time too.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't compare what happened during that time to the stampede, but just to kind of see the city so desolate also made me understand physically what maybe my family felt like,
Yeah.
this kind of emptiness, right? I got to
Yeah.
visualize it, right? That was like my entry into Cambodia then as an adult.
Yeah. You talked about how that trip really was the time that you had decided that you would want to pursue poetry full time, and full time meaning you want to commit to it. And I want to learn a little bit more about that. Have you always loved poetry, and have you always been kind of a creative writer? And did you always know you wanted to write a book?
I did not really step into my passion for poetry until I was in college. It was
Hmm.
probably a year before I went to Saigon. It was the year that my grandmother died. I just was trying to find my voice, which sounds kind of cheesy, but it's true.
Okay.
Yeah, it's I'm not judging myself, but finding your voice, it feels like I did more than just find my voice. It just I don't know how to explain it, but I remember reading poetry by June Jordan, this incredible poet who just really began to politicize me. She was just always writing about the world and keeping such a critical eye on like the US war machine, and just writing poems, about Lebanon, about South Africa, about like, well, she would mention like Cambodia, I think as well. Like I'm pretty sure there was a moment where I was like, oh my God, like anytime I've read anything and someone has mentioned Cambodia in any context, I've always just gotten excited because I never got to really, we never really got to experience that in history
Right.
books. I mean, I was reading this book called Temple Folk. It's a short story collection by Aliyah Bailal. And it mentions our history. And it's like beautiful to see our history connecting to this Black Muslim woman. I just love literature for this reason, right? For this sense of a larger sense of community, right? I knew that I loved poetry, and I was afraid to take it seriously, I guess, because I didn't know what that meant. Like I had no example of what it meant to be an artist. I had no example. And I just kept on looking and looking and looking for other women of color to kind of guide the way. So, I would join writing groups. I was living in DC. I was studying there at the time. I was studying international studies. And I did not want to work for the government, it turned out. I wanted to write poetry. And so I tried to like push that away because I just didn't think it could be possible. And then when I was studying in Saigon, when I was in Laos to visit, and then in Cambodia for the field study, I realized I had a lot to say.
Mm.
And I remember like going to a museum in Vietnam, and I can't remember which one, but there was like a mummy there. And I
Yeah.
just looked at this mummy, and immediately I left the museum. I mean, I was afraid to even go into that room anyways, but I went there and I went alone. I don't know why I went alone, but then I left immediately because I needed to write. I needed to write about it. I needed to write about this experience. And so I realized this is something that I can't live without. So it was more than just finding my voice. It was just finding this light inside of myself that I needed to keep burning, right? This fire,
Mm.
rather. I never thought that I was going to publish a book. I didn't know what that meant. I just knew that I wanted to write. There was a time when I was trying to live in Cambodia and find work there and just start a life there after college. That didn't work out because someone had stolen my purse in traffic, like one of the people, on a motorbike. And
Wow.
I had to let it go, right? And it had my passport, it had my wallet, it had my phone. So I had to like leave the country. But during that time that I was in Cambodia waiting for my new passport to arrive so that I could leave, not that I wanted to. During that time, though, I was there for 3 more months with my family. And I like applied to NYU. I promised a teacher that I would apply to one program, and he chose that program for me. And it was beautiful. His name is David Keplinger, and he was like a teacher that I had in college who just really believed in my poems. He was one of those people who said, okay, yeah, I'll let you attend my class. I'll let you I will add you to the class because it was already way too full. But he tells me today he tells me, I had a feeling about you, he's like, I let you into the class and I applied to NYU. He wrote me a letter of rec, and then he got his own teacher to write me a letter of rec. So I was in Cambodia, just like Wi-Fi wasn't really available at the time. My nephew had to go out to the store every time I ran out of like, I don't know what to call it, but it was like, oh my God, I have this deadline, right? And he just kept on running out to go get it. And so to go get me more like internet data, whatever you call it. But it was like really sad when I got back home because I was like, man, I feel like I failed. I didn't get to start the life that I wanted, that I imagined in Cambodia. But then I ended up getting accepted to NYU and I was over the moon about it. So I came to New York City, which is where I'm currently based, came to New York City, and I was so thrilled to just have this time and space to write poems. And I remember as a prospective student, I was sitting in my really incredible mentor's workshop, Yusuf Kumayaka's workshop. I was like, just like tearing up because it was a room full of poets just talking about language, just talking about words. It was just such an incredible feeling. And I just knew, right? So I love poetry. I really do. And I could talk on and on about it, but you have a lot of questions. If you want me to read a poem, I can start that. I can do that, but I'm happy to like answer any more questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think it's great. I mean, no worries at all because I think it's great to set the background of like how this book became to be, right? And the steps and the levels and the things you had to overcome to really like get to this point. I know you kind of mentioned a little bit about that moment in Vietnam where you were looking at the mummy and you were like, I have to go back and I have to write. Was that kind of how your writing process was in terms of putting this book together? That inspiration would kind of come to you in different moments? What was the writing process like creating this book?
For this book in particular, well, I just wrote a lot of terrible poems. And I mean that in a really kind way to myself because you just have to get out the most rudimentary idea that you have onto the page. But really that's a good question because I don't even remember the first poem that I wanted to put in this book, right? I wrote, again, I was lucky to have this time and space to write, and I had to write this thesis, which then became my chapbook, Year Zero. And I took a lot of those poems and revised them, edited them, and I just, even if a poem is published, I'm still like, well, it's not done yet. And I'll just continue the work. And then I wrote Tul Slang, a long poem in the middle of my book, because that was a really formative experience for me in understanding, learning how to write about trauma and history and place. So I remember that was in the chapbook, and I included that as a centerpiece to my book. I think it took a lot of tears as well. It took a lot of tears writing this book because I was really afraid that it would not be accepted, that it wouldn't be good enough, that I would cause more violence emotionally. I never really knew that people could be proud of me for writing a book of poems. I didn't even know if anybody would read this book, right? But I had an incredible peer in my program just encouraging me to apply to everything so that I could keep writing. And it was like an impossible dream. And I achieved a lot that I set out to do. And I have so many more dreams. I have so many more poems to write about, poems that are not about my history or the genocide that, our history that we share. But yeah, this book, I knew that a lot of it was mythologizing my family's experiences. So you do experience all of these personas in the book. I knew too that it was a responsibility for me as a writer, as a poet, to kind of carry our ancestors that we lost, who were executed and targeted because they were artists and intellectuals.
Right.
Of course, many people have heard this, but a third of the 2 million who perished were artists and intellectuals. And I understood the responsibility there. Like, if I am going to write about our community and our history, and I didn't live through it, but I've inherited this history, like, I had to ask myself, well, what right do I have? I wasn't born in the camps. I was born in Pennsylvania. So I had to get through a lot of those doubts. And I was very, very meticulous in my process. So I would write the poems. And then once I started revising, editing, I would ask certain questions like, does this perpetuate trauma? Does this perpetuate the violence that my people experienced? And so one of the ways that I could write about it from a safe distance was by creating personas. I have a poem called The Last Historian. Some of the personas are mentioned, like the radio host goes into hiding. There is the last historian's wife that's mentioned in there, and she has a poem called I Am Rachana. So there were a lot of voices that came to me, not my voices, which is why I kind of thought it was funny to be like, I had to find my voice. But then, then I got to enter a kind of portal, and other people were writing the book. Other hands were picking up my pen. And that's something that I understood then, is I needed to feel safe while writing the poems, so so I wasn't experiencing a sense of trauma that I was very familiar with because of my upbringing, my family, the silence, right? So then breaking that silence was a whole thing. Talking to my family, telling them, I'm writing a book. Can I talk to you about what you experienced? That was when they finally wanted to open up. Mm-hmm. And then they would just pull me aside and say, oh, you should write about this, and just tell me things, right? But I also included all those little fragments that I kept locked into my memory, everything that I paid attention to that they spilled unknowingly or knowingly, but uncontrollably. I can't trouble saying that word, but it's just, that went all into making this book. And then the last poem, I had struggled writing the last poem, and it's Ode to the Loom, because my grandmother is a weaver from Tegeo, and like, she was the first artist that I ever knew, though I don't know if she called herself an artist. I don't think my family really treated her like one. She just preserved our heritage. She preserved this art form and was celebrated for it, and was able to weave these fabrics for people so they could get married in them. And, it's just really incredible what she did. But I needed to finish the book with a poem, and that included the title of the book, because I just had the title already figured out. I was like, I know that this resonates with me. And this title was taken from like a failed poem. Not that it failed, but I just discarded it. But I was like, I'll keep this line, and it became the title of the book. It started out with the title first, actually, but then the last poem that included the name of the book in the content of the poem, it's like I needed to go to Ithaca, New York, to be on a writing retreat with another Khmer visual artist, a friend that I had made through, because he like read my work, and he was just such a great companion to have during that process of finishing the book. And we drove up to one of the gorges, and that was what inspired me to finish, this poem. Like I knew how it was supposed to end, because, it was winter time. It was icy, but we were like on the rocks and kind of tiptoeing to look at this beautiful waterfall, just this ongoing presence. And so I finished the book with a poem that was celebratory. An ode is a poem that praises something. And in this case, I wanted to praise the loom. And by doing so, I was praising my grandmother. That is a long way of telling you how the book came to be, which is so nice to reflect on, because it's been a really long time since I actually thought about the process of making the book. Yeah.
I think anybody who were to read the poems can tell how meticulous you were and how intentional you were with each of the poems. And it is super interesting to hear you say how you had taken on these different personas, if you will, of different people of the Khmer Rouge, to kind of not only give light to these different perspectives, but also as a tactic to kind of safely separate yourself from like re-traumatizing yourself. And so, and it seems like then the different perspectives that you did highlight in the poem really came from the discussions you had with your parents, and picking out from the little stories that they were sharing, and taking that on. Is that right, Monica?
Yeah, I think I wanted to mention that I really did not want to give space to like Pol Pot, or even like the word Khmer Rouge. I didn't even want to name them. And I just thought somehow by naming them, it would take away power from the ordinary people who survived that time, or the personas I created who perished. There were particular poems that I wrote from my parents' voices, in particular my father's voice, talking about just how I guess my father sometimes, when he talks about his experiences, he talks a lot about how he had to defend himself, and how to be careful, and how to speak kindly to the Khmer Rouge, soldiers. And it's like, I think in a way he talks about it because probably it scares him that he had to go through that. But also to say, I was really smart. I was really smart about this, and I'm proud of myself. But I'm also like, wow, I don't know what could have happened if like, I don't know how to say it. How do I name this? How do I give language to this? Like, I think he really is just in wonder of his own survival.
Yep.
I mean, I know you understand that. Also, speaking to your own family members about this too, about, speaking with your own father through the podcast. And yeah, I have a poem that's in his voice but still it is only a certain feeling that I could capture, you know, is a certain feeling that I could transfer from what he told me to the poem. But I could never really encapsulate everything that they've been through. So I understood that as well. And I think a lot of the other poems about like the women, you know, in my family, there's just this distance of saying that these were four sisters, right, who were hiding. And it's interesting because there's a lot of repetition in this poem. It's called sestina. It's in the form of a
Mhm.
traditional sestina, and all of like usually in traditional sestinas, the very end of the lines are just repeated and woven in different ways throughout the stanzas. And in this case, I broke the rule, and all of the repeated words were scattered, but they were still there. And it's just suggesting that these sisters were hiding. And that poem is about like my mother and her sisters. So I didn't call them by name here, you know, but I think that was part of we can't say our names, you know, because we're hiding, right? So there was a lot of intuiting these things and trying to also locate my family in the English language, not in
Mhm.
Khmer. Because these stories that they're telling me, it's like some in English, but then also really in Khmer. And there's no way, like Khmer is such a poetic language. And
Yeah.
you know, English, it's not as poetic as Khmer. And what they're telling me, the things that they're feeling, I can never translate that into
Mhm.
English. And so I had to find a way to create all of this imagery to help the reader understand the psychological landscape.
Yeah. I recognized the poem Sestina right away when you were describing the sisters, because it was actually one of my favorite poems too. It reminded me a lot of my auntie who had to go in hiding, and I've had her on the podcast as well. So I want to send that to her so
Yeah.
to see how she can relate. In what ways then, Monica, do you feel like writing this book has changed you?
It really allowed me to feel more connected to the Khmer community. I was able to find our people through the written language. Like people reach out to me. They said that they're artists too. And then somehow we'd get together if we were in the same city. So there are just a lot of incredible connections that helped me feel less alone. Because when I was writing the book, I think I was really alone. I felt really alone. But then I met other Khmer writers, and I met, you know, like Khmer chefs, and, you know, there was a painter I met recently, but there's all of these beautiful ways that I just found my people to be in kinship with,
Hmm.
to create art, to continue building. And I think that changed me most of all. Like I said earlier, I didn't really get to have the debut author experience because the book came out during the lockdown in the early days of the pandemic. But I also understood that my book had legs, that it could travel, that people could access it. It was something I let go of. It's like a baby in the world learning to walk. And I know that this book will outlive me. And I think I don't even really know what that means. I don't know if I can know what that means, but I just know that this book is here. It's here to stay, and future generations can read it if they want to. They can be critical of it. They can say, I don't like this book, or they can say, I like this book, or they can say, this book is sad. I want to read this other poet who has more joyful poems. You know, like I think there's so many, and I celebrate all of that, right? I do, because we didn't really get to have that. Like, you know what I mean? We didn't really get to have, you know, like things
An
to even be
opportunity.
critical about.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I
Yeah.
think, and I'm looking forward to learning from writers who are younger than me, and writers who have Oh my God, so many different experiences. Like I know a writer, two writers actually, Khmer women from Long Beach who are writing nonfiction and fiction. I'm just like, oh, I'm yearning for those books. There are amazing writers who are just like, they're working on their poems and they're maybe a little bit timid to publish, but I'm just like, no, I'm greedy. Please, like, please make sure that this book is something I can read and have and hold in my hand. But, I feel a little bit greedy when I say that, but it's all from love. And I want to see more. I want to see more of us doing more things that we never thought could be possible. And then I want us to believe, oh, all of it is possible because it is. I've taught students who said to me that they feel like they really owe their parents something. And they owe their parents, right? Or maybe as another student said, oh, I don't have an interesting story to tell. Like my grandparents do because they survived the genocide. And I'm just like, no, but you are endlessly interesting. Doesn't mean that your story matters less. And I really want young Cambodians to hear that, those who are interested in being creators of anything, so you really do have something to say. And you have to actually begin by saying, I have something to say. Because when you say that, it's almost as though you never said something before. And now you have this new canvas in which to spill your paint on and make your mark. And so I'm very excited about what's happening today. And I guess there's just so much to say. I mean, mostly the book changed me because it brought me community.
Mm-hmm. And for those people who will outlive us but still have this book in their hands, what do you hope the future generations will learn from reading your poems?
Oh, wow. Did I dodge that question earlier? I'm just trying to think, what do I want them to learn? Gosh, I guess I want them to know that their history matters, that it's important to interrogate what it means to be American. And that doesn't always correlate to this narrative of gratitude. Oh, we have opportunities here. Or there's, it's like, I don't think in this book I'm trying to prove that I am American too, and I think there's a narrative like that, all of us grew up with in a sense, right? I'm really trying to talk about US imperialism in this book. I'm being very critical of these nations that call themselves benevolent after they bomb our homeland and displace us and then make life really difficult for us here in America. And those difficulties can be overcome and we can just thrive incredibly, from those challenges. But I think I just really hope the future generations remain critical, continue to fight against empire. There is a genocide in Palestine right now. And when I think about the refugee experience in this country, we've also got to align ourselves with the indigenous people of this land who also were almost erased, right? Still here, but wow, just we're part of this like centuries deep genocide along with the indigenous people. And then thinking about, like police brutality and just Black people being murdered here in this country, all of the Islamophobia here, and just, there's a spike in, just anti-Asian violence, right? Like, I mean, I'm just like naming all of the all of the things, right? And I really do question whether or not we should stop calling our families refugees because of all of the ongoing violence that happened not only to our community, but to other communities too, who we should be in solidarity with. And so I think that this book is just the beginning of critiquing America, in a sense, overthrowing it, because you can finally name that this happened, that, oh man, you guys bombed us. And, like my family's here because of that. So I want the future generations to continue to fight that good fight. I want them to know that there can be many portals that they can enter through in order to access the poem, that there's so many ways to enter the poem, that they can break the rules. Yeah, there's so many things I'd like to say, but I think they will have to think of those answers on their own. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Monica, for your time today. I wanted to close off the podcast with a wonderful reading so that people can kind of get a little sense of your poetry. When you end on that note, I almost think about the poem The Death of Henry.
We should read that one. Do you want me to read that one?
There's so many. Guys, listeners, there are so many to choose from. It's like hard for me to choose. I think I still want to stick with The Radio Host Goes into Hiding, only because I find this poem, when we talk about the way you were so intentional with your writing, I found that specifically this poem, the way that you wrote it, was different. The formatting that you kind of wrote it. And people, when you guys buy the book, you guys can see that the formatting of this poem is very different from the rest. And I would love to know and hear how this is supposed to sound.
Right. I will do my best to this. I'm honored that you asked me to read an excerpt of this poem, because it's a poem that I often don't read to audiences because it's so long. But it is a really important poem to me, and I certainly do think about the scholasticide in Palestine, in Gaza. So this is called The Radio Host Goes into Hiding. And in this excerpt I'm going to read, I will say that the young girl is my mother, and she told me this story. So this is a fragment from a story she told me. So the radio host, this is in his voice. At night, I stand close to Ankar leaders who invite us to their meetings. In loudspeaker, the village chief speaks in slogans, but like water to survive, I must hold on to an individual idea to keep strong, because to be re-educated is to be destroyed. The sweet potato a young girl plants in the ground, 5 miles from the village commune. She does not know I am watching. She hums an Anka song, walking home. I want to also say that, the words are sort of scattered. And as I was writing it, I was like thinking about how the words could be read vertically too. So you could scan your eyes across the page and you could see in slogans an individual idea vertically. In slogans an individual idea, song, walking home. You could see like water to survive, to keep strong, to be re-educated is to be destroyed. Like just that concentration of the words there, of course. To me, my eye goes there first because it feels, like resilient there. I feel like, again, it's the hiding, the radio host, literally the word hiding is in the title. And I'm just thinking about how the words just kind of run across the page and how there is just so much space. And like, I don't know, I just think of the page as like the land and the words as kind of like places that you can hide inside of a word. You can hide inside of a word, but really this sweet potato comes back at the very end. And there is some sense of hope there because a potato is a root vegetable, which you can grow and you can continue to feed people and you can continue to survive with. So thank you for asking me to read that poem. When I read my poems, I go back and I'm just like, oh, I need to, it's like the poems teach me something too every single time. And every time I read it, it's like there are new doors. And so it's fun to talk to you about these things. So thank you.
Yeah, I will say when I was reading this poem in particular, I was thinking maybe she's spacing this out as if somebody was recalling their memory. And you know how memories are never fluid. They always
Yep.
come in, as you said, fragments. And that's the way my father remembered a lot of his trauma as well. Like they'd never come in one piece. They'd be
Mm-hmm.
he'd recall something, then he'd stop, and then he'd say a word, and then he'd stop.
Yeah.
So I thought, I don't know, I could be wrong, but that's kind of what I was thinking in my head. I was like, maybe she's spacing it out in a way as if somebody was recalling a memory.
Absolutely. I love that reading. And also, when I recall an earlier draft, it was called Field Journal. So these were the notes that a researcher, if a researcher could have been there and had
Mm-hmm.
written everything down, these are the notes, just really scattered writing. Some of them are not perfect sentences. I mean, there's no punctuation in it. These are notes, and certainly those notes become those memories too, and they're all fragmented, but they're the most important things that you hold on to. And so, oof, yeah. And memory is a whole conversation. Memory itself, goodness. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, Monica, thank you so much for joining us today. It truly was an honor to have you not only talk about your poems and the inspiration behind them, the process, but also having a special reading for us. Feel so honored to have that little snippet for our listeners. Where can people find you if they want to find you? As we did the reading today, I don't know, do you offer readings to like schools and stuff like that? Where can people find
Mhm.
you?
Yeah, it's so funny because my first thought, you won't be able to find me because I myself am like staying very low key. I don't want to say I'm hiding exactly, but I'm like,
She's
you
like,
can't
don't
find
find
me.
me.
I'm
Don't
like,
find
don't leave
me.
me alone. I'm just saying that because I've just been so deep in working on the next book. And so I'm not
Mm,
necessarily trying to put myself out there. However, of course, you can write to me. You can find me on my website, monicasuk.com, and you can invite me to, read at your school or in your reading series or at any kind of event. I'd love to participate. To be honest, I think it's been a while since I've really given FaceTime to audiences, and it would be really nice. I always enjoy my time talking to people about poetry. So you can find my words in some publications that are coming out, new poems through the magazine The Believer and also New England Review. But now that you're asking me how people can find me, I'm like, oh yeah, social media, but I barely go on there. So I'm like, oh wait, people usually say their handles. But I'm just gonna say you can find me on Instagram, but I barely post right now. It's Monica Juice. And juice, I learned in Polish, it's sok. So you'll see like
Oh,
carrot juice and it'll say 100% sok. And so it's just a play on words.
oh, I love
Monica
that.
juice.
I love that.
But yeah, I really am excited for the newer poems. I'm really excited about that. And hopefully you'll be able to find me there in the words. So thank you so much, Dorothy. This was really lovely. I'm so grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you so much. No, I know that your poems, especially in this one, and I'm so excited for what you're working on next, but I know at least for the poems in this particular book are really going to touch a lot of people. It touched me for sure. As I was reading it on a plane, I could not stop and I could not as I said before in the beginning, I could not believe how beautifully you had presented something that can be very heavy and really dark. And you did it in such a beautiful way. So again, thank you so much for coming on here. And yeah, I hope the listeners will be able to get a hold of your book and really feel the power of your words.
Thank you.